Hey everybody, we are going to start lesson 3.7, which is the Articles of Confederation, the first government of the United States. And by the end of this lesson, you should be able to explain how different forms of government developed in the United States and how those governments changed as a result of the Revolutionary period. So we're going to start off and talk about state governments first, because each of the colonies, once independence was declared, had to form a new government. The royal government was gone. And these colonies, according to the Declaration, were states. And states means that a geographic entity is sovereign, it's self-governing, and it's independent. So all 13 of the colonies then became 13 new states, independent from each other. So they had to draft constitutions to outline their framework for government. And in most states, they wrote the constitution so that the executive branch was very weak and the legislative branch was very strong. And that goes back to the colonial idea that representatives should be made up of the people they are governing so they can be held accountable. And executives, history had taught them from the king appointing the royal governors, need to be as weak as possible because they are not as accountable to the people. The other thing these new constitutions had to address is voting requirements, because they had to determine who gets to vote in these legislative elections. And in most of the colonies, they established voting rights for white men over 21 who held property. And property meant not just land, but something of value. It could be a building, it could be a farm, it might be a shop, but you had to own property. And their thinking was that when taxation was levied, property was what was taxed. So under the theory, no taxation without representation, you want the people voting being the people that are going to be impacted by the tax. If you didn't own property, if you were working class or a poor farmer who rented farmland, you would be voting for tax increases, but you wouldn't have to feel the consequence of it. So that was the justification for property rights. Now, if we take a look at the central government, during the Revolution, they formed an Articles of Confederation as the first national government for the United States. And the Articles is what the preamble calls a firm league of friendship. And you can tell by those words that they were saying that the states were still sovereign. They were still independent entities entering into this mutual agreement, this league of friendship with each other, which would address certain national needs, but by no means was supposed to impose its will on the people. Their thought was that representatives in the national capital, which at the time was New York, were too far away from the people. Their state representatives in the state capitals were the ones that they had the most influence over. It did create an Articles Congress. It was a unicameral legislature. Unicameral means one chamber, and that Congress could make certain policies for the United States, and each state got equal votes. There was no executive like a president, and there was no national judicial branch or Supreme Court. They left that up to the states. The power of this Articles Congress, this national government, was very limited. It could not tax, for example. It could not regulate trade between the states, nor could it create a military. All of those things were left up to the state governments. So, for example, the Articles Congress, if they needed revenue, could ask the state legislatures to create a tax or to share part of their taxation, but it could not tax the people directly. And again, all of this is a reaction to British government. Under this rickety framework, this Articles, problems quickly arose. One problem was international trade. Could the Articles Congress negotiate a trade agreement with foreign countries that was binding for all the states? Or do they have to negotiate their own agreements? King George was throwing some shade at the United States, and he said, do we need one treaty or 13? Poking fun at the fact that we really didn't have an established government. Second was a problem with taxation and debts. During the American Revolution, the Second Continental Congress had accrued quite a bit of debt. They had borrowed money from Americans, they had borrowed money from other countries, and now the Articles Congress was responsible for paying that back. But they didn't have the power to raise taxes, so they had no means to pay that back, which meant the Articles government was not paying its debts. People it owed money to did not get paid. That weakened it even further. Interstate commerce was a problem as well. Interstate means between the states. So trade between the states became problematic when some of the states threw up trade barriers, or taxes on goods imported from other states. Those states then retaliated with each other. So there's taxation if you're trading from Delaware to next door to Pennsylvania. There was no common currency. There was no national economy for the United States. Foreign relations like international trade were also problematic. The United States could not speak with one voice when it came to foreign affairs, so other governments didn't recognize us. They thought we were going to be a short-lived experiment. Only France had any sort of recognition of the United States as a government. The final problem was the biggest problem, and that was the problem of internal unrest and Shays' rebellion. What was happening in states was a lot of the farmers who had loaned the Second Continental Congress money to fight the revolution now needed that money back to pay their mortgages, to run their farms. And when the Articles Congress couldn't pay it back, those farmers were left with that debt. And in the state of Massachusetts, the wealthy bankers began foreclosing on their farms and taking away their livelihoods. The farmers appealed to the Massachusetts legislature to provide some sort of assistance to protect their farms from foreclosure, but the legislature was not responsive to them. So Daniel Shays was a poor farmer in Massachusetts, and he organized the other farmers and about a group of 500 to march from the frontier. They were on the edge of the colony where the poorer people lived, to the capital and to overthrow the government. And this was based on the idea that the state legislature had violated the social contract and it wasn't addressing the needs of the people. So Shays' rebellion, the idea caught on in other colonies, and the wealthy elite of the United States were very worried. It was quickly put down by Massachusetts legislature, but it led to concerns among the wealthy elite. What happens if this fire would have spread to other states, and soon it would have been up and down all 13? The national government couldn't do anything to stop it. So they said, we need to get together and we need to revise the articles. We need to fix them to address these problems and specifically empower the national government a little bit more. The third thing we need to talk about is Westward Settlement in the new United States. If you remember, the proclamation line was drawn up by the British along the Appalachian Mountains. Colonists on this side, natives on the other side. That line is gone with the British. So now Western settlers who are at that fringe of the colonies pushed through the Appalachian Mountains into what is called the Northwest Territory. That is the territory that is around the Great Lakes, and it includes Michigan, Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. So it's the area in which the new colonists were settling. It was area that was open for farmland. So with the Northwest Territory created, Congress also established the Northwest Ordinance, which was a series of laws that set policy guidance for how they were going to settle these new territories. The first thing the Northwest Ordinance establishes is what is a territory. It is a temporary provisional government. It's not a state, and a territorial government will be formed when X number of settlers arrive in that territory. As the population grows, that territorial government can then draft a constitution and apply to Congress for statehood. So population determined the movement from just territory into state. Second, the government established a grid over the Northwest Territory. They divided it up very orderly, kind of looks like graph paper. And they divided it into territories, and then each territory is divided into townships. Each township was divided into sections. And those were sold off by the national government. It was the only way they could raise money. And this was the first time that property was held by the national government became privately owned property. It was sold to people who could do with it what they wanted. That was the first transfer of property from national government to private property holders in the United States. Third, they required that when Section 16 of each territory was sold, the revenue for that went to establish public education in the territory. So public schools were mandated for all these new territories. That was something you didn't find in other states. And finally, there was a prohibition on slavery. The national government, for the very first time, said no slavery in the Northwest Territory. And it established the right of the Articles of Congress and the national government to determine where slavery could exist. Now, with that said, the reality was that slavery appeared throughout the Northwest Territory. And that's because the national government can pass all the laws they want, but enforcement falls to the state legislatures and even the city and county governments. The local sheriff is the one who has to say, you can't bring your slaves into this community. And in many cases, your local government and even some of your territorial government were slave owners. So they simply didn't enforce federal law. Okay, with that said, we're going to talk again about how these different forms of government, state and national, developed, why they developed the way they did, and how did they change as a result of the Revolutionary period. Thank you guys, and we'll see you again soon.